Hi, I'm Tan Dawn Wei, and I'm a senior columnist at the Straits Times. Joining us today is the Minister of State for Manpower, Dinesh Vasu Dash. Thank you for coming today and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I wanted to start with a vibe check.
Okay.
It's been a little over a year since you joined the cabinet as Minister of State for Manpower and Culture, Community and Youth. You're also Mayor of Southeast District and also an MP of East Coast GRC. That's a lot of hats to wear. How do you split your time between all these roles?
So it's very much engagement heavy. So a lot of engaging different stakeholders, understanding their concerns, having conversations, trying to see where we can help. So it takes up a lot of time, but it's very purposeful work. You're able to then add positive outcomes to not just the stakeholders, but to Singapore as a whole. And so that's what excites me. And it's been an interesting year. You really have to curate your time very carefully because weekends are usually quite packed. Actually, weekdays are packed too, since there are multiple portfolios.
Yeah. When you first took over the Manpower portfolio, what did you think would be some of your biggest challenges, and what would you say has been the most difficult part of the job?
Well, I had thought that I would be looking at migrant worker issues, among others, given the fact that I was involved in COVID. And in COVID, we were dealing quite a bit with migrant workers, but of course the general population as well.
Yeah.
And so landing the migrant worker portfolio was not unsurprising, but it gave me a sense of how complicated situations may be and how can we then manage the portfolio. Of course, together with that, I also deal with the health and safety portfolio. I deal with the progressive wage and low-wage workers. And so really the vulnerable among Singapore. And that gave me a very different perspective of challenges that the vulnerable in Singapore are facing and what do we need to put in place as far as policies are concerned to make sure that they are taken care of. So that was quite interesting, quite challenging, and we had to put in deliberate policies to allow that to benefit our most vulnerable.
Yeah. I was going to ask about this as well because you were previously the Chief Executive Officer of the Agency for Integrated Care,
Yes.
where you helped, the most vulnerable people in society or some of the most vulnerable people. And you did talk about wanting to continue to support vulnerable people. So I was wondering how that might have shaped your thinking about, say, migrant worker issues and also labor policy.
Yes. So the need for our policies to work, particularly for the ones who are most vulnerable, is important. And we have to pay particular attention to make sure that their voices are heard, to make sure we are clear about, the best ways at which we can derive policies to help them. Having said that, of course, a lot of the folks that I've highlighted as vulnerable often would not be able to articulate the concerns that they're facing, not able to articulate what kind of levers or support they might need. And hence, there was really a need for someone to help, not just me, but, the unions, my colleagues in MOM, NGOs, even employers, for them to have their voices heard and to be clear of, ways at which we can intervene in a reasonable way in order to allow us to then provide for some degree of upliftment among the various vulnerable groups that we had. So, for example, for low-wage workers, there was a deliberate effort taken this year at the budget to increase their salaries from $1,600 to $1,800. Again, it was an important step I felt that needed to have been taken, and it was something that the most vulnerable would see that as a useful addition as far as salaries and remuneration is concerned. But in the wider scheme of things, I thought it was only sensible for us to do this particular move, and I was very glad that it was accepted when it was raised.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, it's not only about the view of vulnerable workers and one segment of society alone. We would have to look at it from an overall perspective. So it's not about low-wage workers for low-wage workers self, but it is low-wage workers relative to other groups of workers in our workspace. We also have to look out for employers to make sure that it's sustainable to employers, right? Because just a general floor, kind of a minimum wage, and you just lift everything up, regardless of whether or not there's productivity, whether or not there's skills upliftment and so forth, would just add the burden onto our employers. And that will then result in employers feeling the pinch, and government will have to come in as well to find a way to balance the entire support up. Unions are also there, so unions have also been very forthright in explaining the conditions and the situations that many of our vulnerable workers are facing as well, and hence it's been a tripartite type of a conversation, and that really is one of the strengths that we have in MOM. I didn't anticipate the extent of the conversations and the extent of the ecosystem as far as the tripartite system is concerned, but I've been able to appreciate it a lot more in the last 1 year. The work that our Employers Federation does, the work that our NTUC does, all of which helps to shape stronger policy, all of which everyone would have to carry a certain load, and we have to sit down together and land on a common point. And that in itself would take a bit of time before we get there. So it's about making sure that everyone is taken care of, not just one particular segment of society.
When you say you didn't anticipate, how exactly do you mean?
Well, there's a need for conversations. And again, these are conversations that take place at the leadership levels, among the staff, in order to ensure that everyone's interests are taken into consideration. We try not to create a situation where one party benefits at the expense of another party. And it's always about trying to reach a comfortable equilibrium across government, across the unions, and across employers. Of course, unions to support workers. And where there may not be union coverage for certain sectors, then the government will have to look out for those sectors to just make sure that everybody is equally taken care of. And we don't have a situation where segments of society is almost not taken care of, and therefore they fall off the radar. So we have to be sure that all of them are taken into consideration. We have to, given the business outlook, sometimes we have to be cautious about imposing too much on our employers as well. Otherwise, it's only one directional, and the employers may feel the hit. And when employers, if they are not able to sustain their operations, then what happens is that the workers will then be will have to bear the cost of them falling out of business too. There won't be jobs. So we'll have to make sure that the ecosystem is, in equilibrium as much as we can. Of course, there'll be retrenchments from time to time. And again, here I must say that the unions have done fantastic work in making sure that our folks who are retrenched find equivalent jobs as quickly as possible. Some will take slightly longer than others, but by and large, the system is in place to be able to support one another. Another area that I think is quite important for me to also highlight is that given the fact that sometimes there's a lot of anxiety about jobs and whether or not there are enough jobs, and young people, I spoke to a school recently and they were worried if they have to work harder and whether or not would there be jobs in the future. And in order to anticipate that, in this year's Economic Strategies Review outcomes, one of which was to highlight the merger of Skills Future Singapore and the Workforce Development Authority. And we now call it the Skills and Workforce Development Authority. Now, it might seem that it's just a merger of two entities, but if you think about it deeper, it's about the connection between skills and jobs so that residents will have a more seamless pathway in order to be able to ultimately land jobs. And that is the key focus of this government. There are still about 32,000 jobs when I last counted that hasn't been fulfilled, and these are for entry-level jobs. So there are jobs that are available, and there will, at least as at now, there are far more jobs than there are people who are looking for jobs. It's about trying to find that match, trying to make sure that the marriage happens, and that is where at multiple levels we are trying our best to make sure that opportunities and the demand is equivalent to those people who are looking for jobs, and to allow for that match to take place.
Yeah. Okay. Let's bring the attention back to migrant workers.
Sure.
Would you be able to give us an update on the over 407, I think,
Yes.
migrant workers who went without, salary, who went to MOM for help? I know the case is still under investigation, so there might be certain things that you might not be able to share.
Sure.
But are there things that you can tell us, some updates about whether or not they've landed jobs?
Yeah, maybe I should zoom out a bit and just highlight that we are not fixated on migrant workers for migrant workers' sake, but migrant workers are a very important element of the overall workforce structure, and that is because Singaporeans have gotten better jobs. And so you don't see very many Singaporeans in the construction sector, which is predominantly migrant worker based, just by virtue of the fact that it's onerous, it's you're facing the elements and so forth. And that's the reason why we need the migrant workers to be doing the roles that we'd rather for Singaporeans not to do, and for Singaporeans then to take higher level jobs in different sectors, and therefore they move up the chain, as we have seen over the last couple of years. So migrant workers are important, and by focusing on migrant workers, it does not mean that Singaporeans aren't important. In fact, Singaporeans are most important, and all our labour policies have been configured around Singaporeans. So in order to take migrant workers, I need to hire Singaporeans too. So that is how the policies have been organized and arranged. Now, in the case of this particular instance, it was rather unfortunate that salaries of about ranging from between 2 to 4 months hadn't been paid to this group of workers, all of whom turned up in MOM, and they indicated that there was a problem because they haven't been paid for a couple of months. We looked at the stats, and if you look at the number of salary claims that we have seen, usually we see about 5 in 100,000. So it's not really very many migrant workers who have issues per se in terms of salary concerns. And even when they raise it, 92% of them gets resolved. So the point is, not very many migrant workers are not being paid, and it doesn't usually happen in large groups. So this is an anomaly, and systems are always in place to ensure that we are able to then detect it as much as we can. But understandably, because of business cycles, because of cash flow, sometimes workers or the employers may not be able to honor a month of pay, but then they make up the following month and so forth. So we have to balance the tolerance such that we allow the employers to also function without it being too onerous, and at the same time we are looking out for workers' interests to make sure that they're being paid. So that is a balance that needs to be struck throughout the conversation. Now, for this particular case, unfortunately, it was a range of about 2 to 4 months, and they came in to report their case to MOM, and then it indicated that there was 400 odd folks who had issues, and they weren't able to receive their pay. Some of them who have just arrived not too long ago, and they were having real issues back home. I remember speaking to one of them, and he told me that his daughter was in school, and he has been here for a couple of years, and he wasn't able to pay the school fees. And the school in India is now, threatening for the daughter to be, moved out of the school. So these are very sad, outcomes that happens as a result of some employers not being very responsible. And so as a result of that, as you know, the union stepped in, MOM stepped in. So in other words, we have been able to return back through various means the salaries that were owed to them. Secondly, they have been, about 385 of them have found alternative jobs. So that means that clearly there is demand in the sector, and we were able, through the good work of MWC, the Migrant Welfare Center, as well as NTUC and MOM, we were able to then pivot them to other areas of need within the same sector. So they were able to receive their jobs as well. We are still looking out to hope to get as many of them to be employed and at the same time to reimburse as many of them as we can. Of course, all of this would take a bit of time as we investigate and get the necessary documents and so forth. So that's where we are. Again, just to clarify, it is a very unfortunate situation that happened as a result of not a very responsible employer. But at the same time, migrant workers are just one segment of the overall workforce. Now, I know of some commentators who have highlighted the difference between retrenched workers and the migrant workers who weren't paid their salaries. I think there's a slight distinction because usually for retrenched workers, they are told in advance. It's not that they are not being paid. Sometimes you're given, some degree of funding in order to allow for that separation to take place, and there's usually some remuneration as well.
Yeah.
Whereas in the case of the migrant workers, they had nothing to work with, and they have been not having a salary for a couple of months. So slight distinction, both of which are painful processes, emotionally very troubling, whether you're retrenched or whether in this case, you haven't been paid. But by and large, MOM keeps an even hand in ensuring that both migrant workers, as well as most importantly, Singaporeans, are also taken care of at any one point in time. There are people who would be highlighting that, they need jobs, they don't have jobs and so forth. I would encourage them to look out for either E2I, that belongs to NTUC, an outlet that allows them to allow for that pairing to take place between people who are keen to find jobs and to determine where these vacancies may be.
Yeah, I think it's definitely very heartening to see how quickly MOM and also MWC stepped in to help the migrant workers that were affected. But the scale of it, did that surprise you?
It did. And I think had the workers highlighted to us earlier that there were issues, that would have helped to address issues a bit more expeditiously. Unfortunately, we weren't aware of the extent of how many people who aren't being paid until it was 3-4 months later anyway. So that early intervention, I think, always helps. And even that awareness that there is a issue which we would not know until the workers formally inform us, that would have helped to address the issue a bit earlier. But by and large, I think we've got a relatively good outcome to a not so pleasant episode.
Sure.
And that's where we are.
Yeah. I understand that MOM has actually quite a robust system of having fast officers on the ground, and they go around to the dorms and they check in on the migrant workers to make sure that they're doing okay.
Yes.
So the question is, why is it that this was not picked up earlier?
Well, firstly, I must say that our fast officers do a fantastic job, and they started during the height of COVID, where there were concerns that migrant workers may have had, either because of their food, because of their situation, or because of conditions with employers and so forth. Again, often it happens through conversations, and the migrant workers, if they do highlight it to FAST, which is a somewhat informal channel of feedback, then we are able to then pick it up. But if they don't highlight it, and sometimes they wouldn't want to because they are loyal to their employers, they want the employers to continue hiring them and so forth, there is a tendency for migrant workers to just suffer in silence. And that is exactly what we are hoping to try to unpack with the various channels that we have, be it in terms of their app, in terms of reaching to any one of our service centers and highlighting their concerns, or many ways that they can get to us. And if they can do that, then we'll be able to intervene earlier and help them faster.
Yeah, so that seems to be quite a significant choke point, because a lot of, we've heard so much about how migrant workers are afraid to come forward to report abuse because they're afraid of losing their jobs, they're afraid of being sent home, because most of them are very heavily in debt, having incurred a lot of recruitment fees. How do we give confidence to them to come forward early, instead of waiting until the situation has become untenable?
Yeah. So as part of the onboarding, when they enter Singapore, all these are clearly highlighted to them. what are the channels that are available? If they aren't happy or they're being abused, what else needs to be done? I wanted to also say that over the last couple of years, tremendous effort has been taken by MOM to allow for their primary health care to be taken care of, their mental health to be taken care of. We have a 24-hour hotline. We've got operators who are psychologists who are available for them to speak to in their native languages as well, and so forth. So we have done a lot to look out for the mental and physical well-being of our migrant brothers. The whole idea then would be for them to step forward and to highlight if they have any issues that they might have in their hearts or their minds. Now, often it's not about, I don't think they aren't aware of the channels that are available, but they may choose not to indicate those, through the formal channels or somewhat informal channels, as I said, through ACE and so forth. Well, we work with NGOs too, and our NGO partners are a useful outlet for us to also pick up if there are issues that are happening on the ground. So if they do not highlight it to any of the channels that are available, it will be quite difficult for us to pick it up. But there are ample channels available. Let me give you another example of our recreational centers. So we have built about 8 recreational centers across Singapore today for migrant workers to have recreational activities, sports, a meal, and some quiet time and so forth. Now, again, even there are people who they can talk to. So it's a non-work environment. It's a safe space. So there are places and there are options that are available. And I would encourage more migrant workers to highlight their concerns, and at the same time for employers to also, be mindful of what their migrant workers may be going through, intentionally or otherwise. Sometimes they may not be aware, to be fair to the employers too. Of course, in this case, if you are not paid salaries, then that's a different issue. But for those who are may not be aware of mental stress that their migrant workers may be going through, sometimes a simple conversation, would help. We have also built what we call Friends of ACE. These are migrant worker buddies. So you don't need to talk to someone else that you're not comfortable with. You can talk to your own the buddy system that we've put in place inside the dorms, so that the friends of ACE are able to. ACE is, of course, the agency that helps the migrant workers settle in and understand what their concerns are. An informal channel that I've said. So one other alternative would be for them to talk to ACE through buddies within the migrant worker network. So there are many options that are available, and they have to highlight what their concerns may be.
Yeah. I understand that MOM also has a system of looking at, say, levy default and CPF contributions default. Did those kick in this time around for this case?
There were 1 or 2 cases of default, but it wasn't to the same scale as what we saw in terms of the numbers appearing to the service center. So there was you could argue that there was a light signal, or a light indicator. It did come out somewhere in June, but before we could do any investigations, they turned up at the service center. So it wasn't something that, they haven't been paid for months, including their levies and stuff like that. So that wasn't something that came up, at least from what we have heard so far.
This question is a burning question that is really out there, and lots of people are talking about it. So I do have to ask you, which is, how is it that they can hire 400-something workers? Where is the local quota?
Yes. So that is what is currently being investigated. There could be some of them who are already employed, and there could be some of them who may be, what you would indicate as phantom workers. So that detail is still not out there yet. And if it is that there are people who have been employed and they are not physically working there, then actions will be taken against the phantom workers as well. So that happens from time to time. Again, MOM does extensive investigations and inspections and so forth. And when we do uncover cases of people, Singaporeans who are masquerading as being part of the company, but they're not quite working there, then action will have to be taken against them too.
What kind of lessons do you think we can glean from this episode?
Well, first, I think workers need to step forward, especially migrant workers, if they feel that they have been wronged. If you aren't paid your salary, and if your employer is not highlighting to you that, when are you going to be receiving your salaries, and you have missed a salary milestone, I think it's not right, and I think it's important for migrant workers to step forward. They can step forward by talking to TADEM officers. They can step forward by talking to MWC officers belonging to NTUC, all of which are options that are available to our migrant workers. Second, employers have to be a lot more cognizant, and they shouldn't be irresponsible, because it is understandable sometimes that you might have a short duration of cash flow crunch, but that communication to the workers, to highlight to them what the situation is, and to fairly compensate our workers, particularly in relation to our Employment of Foreign Workers, Foreign Manpower Act, is an important lever. It's a legal lever that they have to comply with. And as long as the employers are complying with the laws, I think we'll have less of a problem. In terms of, can we calibrate our early warning system in MOM a bit more finely? It is possible, but we must be mindful that if you calibrate it too finely, there'll be a lot of false positives. And we will be pushing the burden from one part of the system to the other, and it may not be very fair to some parts of our ecosystem. Could very well be employees. Could very well be employers, for example, who may then have to spend a lot more time explaining to MOM why certain things are happening. But if it is a breach of a law, either the Employment Act or the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act, then yes, that should take place, and that conversations should carry on, and we do need to tighten up areas that may have certain deficiencies. We will know once the investigations are over, and we will do the necessary tightening.
Yeah. So in the wake of this crisis, the NGOs, some of the NGOs like TWC2 and Home, they have resurfaced some of their recommendations, such as a wage insurance scheme, or an escrow payment system for wages, greater job mobility. Do you think that these recommendations could be considered by MOM?
Well, we will consider all options that benefits workers. And it will not be a situation where we will say that, certain ideas are not taken into consideration because it didn't come or didn't start or emanate from the ministry. So we're willing to accept any option, but they have to be studied very closely. And we'll then have to ask ourselves, does it benefit what we have? The system that we have, does it add value? Who does the burden then fall upon? Is it overly burdensome on our employers, for example? And how do we then allow for that balance to take place? For example, an escrow account, we do have a security deposit today, and employers are expected to pay $5,000 per worker. And if we think that amount is too low, we can always increase that if there's a need to do so, but that will add to business costs too. So we'll have to balance it to figure out how do we balance, what else do we need to do to ensure that the system allows for our workers to be protected. Now, for unemployment or rather redundancy insurance, in that matter, I don't think it should be focused on only migrant workers. It should be focused on all. And for Singaporean workers, we have the job support scheme, and that functions similar to that of an insurance system. We started it about 2 years ago. So once we have taken all of this into account, and as we relook at our Employment Act, necessary actions or necessary interventions can be included in the next lap.
Higher recruitment fees is another major concern for migrant workers. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that there's anything that can be done to improve that process?
Higher recruitment fees as a result of levies, or?
Oh, higher recruitment fees that a lot of these migrant workers have to pay in order to land jobs in Singapore.
That unfortunately would be a function of the activities in the source country, so that we don't have much control over middlemen who might be within the countries of origin, and whether or not they are charging a certain amount for them to be moved from one part of the country to another, and for them to be brought over to Singapore and so forth. But what we can control is to make sure that the people that we are working with both here as well as in the source countries, are reasonable. And if we find that there are people who may be less reasonable, then I think we can make those adjustments to favor those who may be less burdensome on the migrant workers per se. So I think that those are some areas that perhaps we can look at. But for now, our interventions have all been focusing on what happens the moment they get into Singapore. How can we take care of them? How can we house them? How can we provide for what they need? How can we allow them to lead happy work lives in Singapore, a working life in Singapore? For example, a recent recent survey among our migrant workers indicated that 9 out of 10 of them are happy with the living and the working conditions in Singapore. So that was done in 2024. So we'll have to figure what else we can do. But most people are quite happy to be still working in Singapore because they feel that the cost benefit is still in their favor. But for a high upfront cost, it will really be at the source country. And we can try to, nudge employers to source from legitimate sources, and and we can have those conversations as well. But as I said, our interventions and the laws kick in only after they get into Singapore.
Yeah. So even with this high recruitment fees issue, the NGOs have also some recommendations about that. TWC2, for instance, has proposed a jobs portal where you cut out the unethical middlemen, and it's basically the workers can go straight onto the jobs portal to look for jobs. Is that something that you think might be feasible?
I would be ready to consider practical solutions. A job portal in some of these countries where I'm not too sure where they have their training from or whether they have access to the net, for example, in itself is questionable. So without which it's very difficult for us to indicate, whether or not a job portal would work, or whether or not unscrupulous middlemen can still, through the jobs portal, find ways to circumvent the system anyway. And that's how it's been. Every policy or every intervention will have a reaction, and it's a cat and mouse type of a game. So if it's a good enough suggestion, I don't think we are foreclosed to considering it, but it has to work for the worker. And often it happens once they are here, for which we can see them, we provide them with medical services, we provide them with mental health services, with counseling services and so forth, and we'll be able to then better understand what their situation is. Very difficult for us to do that at the host country, because we don't have much levers over there. So it's still something that we will have to figure what works best. But as long as it's practical, we'll be very happy to consider it.
Yeah. Is there a level of dependence on migrant workers that worries the government?
Well, it's not a level of dependence, but it was structured in a way where we do need migrant workers for some of the work that's being done in Singapore, be it in terms of, some degree of horticultural work, some degree of, maintenance work, some degree of construction work, and so forth. We do depend on migrant workers, and the reason is really because we prefer for Singaporeans to not be in those fields and to be in other sectors as well. But that said, the way government manages migrant workers is for there to be a ratio of locals that you need to employ in order for there to be migrant workers that you can then bring. Certain sectors, the ratios are a bit more generous, and in certain sectors, the ratio is a bit more stringent. But the ratios are there for the purpose of making sure that you get a fair share of Singaporeans and migrant workers, and it cannot be migrant workers for migrant workers' sake. It has to be in support of Singaporeans.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think we have evolved to a current situation where we need the migrant workers to do certain roles that we felt was the most optimal perspective from a manpower landscape perspective, and we felt that was perhaps best for us to be in. again, it'll be a very different situation if you have construction work being done by Singaporeans, for example. The cost of that will be slightly different. The outcomes of work for Singaporeans and so those sectors will also be different. I mean, there are Singaporeans working in construction too, but we hope for them to be in supervisory foreman roles, maybe even higher, and for them to move up the chain, earning more salaries and moving up the ladder. And that to us would be most useful and helpful. As far as migrant workers are concerned, we hope for there to be a pool that will help with our day-to-day construction and upkeep of the city. And over time, we see some rotation. New folks comes in, the older ones go back, and so forth. So that's where we see the manpower landscape of Singapore as being.
So we have a foreign workers levy, which has been around for quite a long time.
Yes.
And the purpose of that is partly to encourage productivity and innovation, and also to sort of rely less on cheap labor. Do you think that the levy has achieved its objective?
Well, I would say that the levy, it's always a work in progress. So, for example, certain work sites that I've been to have indicated, or they have certain implements that helps with productivity. Certain machines, gadgets, robots that helps to do the role that would have otherwise been done by a person. And that then reduces the headcount cost. The levy is meant to be a deterrent for them to, recruit too many migrant workers who may not be doing as purposeful work as needs to be done. We want our migrant workers to be skilled. We want our migrant workers to be, cross-deployable to other sectors, other sites and so forth. And by and large, we are getting that pool into Singapore. But I think more needs to be done to improve productivity in certain areas, certain sectors. Admittedly, in certain sectors, it'll be a bit more difficult depending on the conditions, the situations, the cost of certain machines and so forth. But it's a journey that companies would have to take because cost of manpower is a key consideration that many companies has. And we have to make sure that they are, they would have to take steps in order to ensure that their headcount costs is kept under control at any point in time. And therefore, productivity levers are the only option that's available. Can they do more? I think more can be done. We can look at certain countries and learn more from them. And commercial companies would have to take on additional, equipment of that of sorts, to be able to then perform their roles in a more efficient way and a more productive way.
Yeah. I suppose one of the downsides, if I may use that word, to the levy is that inevitably the cost of the levy, sometimes it gets passed, right, from the employer to the migrant worker, because the levy we're talking about as much as $900 a month for some workers. And then employers factor that into the overall cost that they have to fork out for this one particular worker. And what we've seen is that maybe, sometimes they do depress the wages of some of these workers. How do we deal with something like that?
If it's an unfair payment, then it has to be raised to TADEM and raised to MOM, and we will investigate. And certain times, they are not supposed to pass the levy down to individuals or the workers. And there are feedback mechanisms that are available for workers to then report these activities which are not supposed to be the case. If I'm not wrong, it's against the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act. But again, it has to be examined, and then from there, actions will have to be taken. So if there's a clear breach of the law, then I think it's an easy answer of what needs to be done. But again, the awareness needs to be there. As I said, these things are explained to migrant workers the moment they enter Singapore, but they have to make a choice because they can always move from one employer to the other too. And when they move from one employer to the other, and it's very, if the other employer is not doing such unsavory practices, then it's all the more for them to use the free market and move towards employers that are more, who take care of their workers better.
What would a successful labor policy around migrant workers look like in, say, 20 years? Would we have more automation, fewer workers, better protection?
Yeah. So firstly, I do think the number of migrant workers we are seeing today is as a result of somewhat, a backlog of construction that has been caused because of COVID. So it will take us a few years to get past that, construction needs that has been backloaded as a result of COVID. But over time, we hope for the number of migrant workers to be lesser. Firstly, because of the fact that you wouldn't have to have intensive construction, for example, at the rate at which we're going right now because of the backlog that we have. But also, we want to make sure that our migrant workers are skilled. They're able to then, similar to what we do for the progressive wage model for Singaporeans, we hope for migrant workers to also pick up skills, move up the chain, be able to then command higher salaries, be able to provide greater value add, be an asset to the companies and so forth. And that then allows for lesser number of migrant workers that we should be seeing in the community. So that to me is one. As far as benefits are concerned, as I said, we have provided for quite a lot of facilities for them, including healthcare, including their dormitories that are today far less cluttered as it used to be. In fact, MOM has built our own dorms, and we are operating our own dorms. And sometimes we build and we allow operators to operate the dorms as well. So different models, but the whole purpose is to get the building cost to be insourced by government so that allows for a correct configuration, and that allows for more space that the migrant workers will have in their dorms and a better living condition overall. So again, government has also put in a lot of money for recreational sites and recreational centers. And I think in the next couple of years, we should be seeing not only a single point where migrant workers congregate at, but different points that are spread across the island, and that will give them the ability to reminisce some of their experiences that they will have in their country, but at the same time be in a contained environment, right, where they can meet with their friends from their villages where they're from, and they can get all the necessary services that they need. We hope for a situation where they need not all congregate at the MOM service center for work pass renewals or any other forms of administration, but for administration to be decentralized and for them to be able to do that at convenient locations so that they don't need to travel all the way to MOM sites, and they're able to then, maximize the time that they have, not in these administrative functions, but for themselves. And we hope for that to then allow for a better experience for our migrant workers. Can we do more? I think more can be done, especially in terms of their recreation, in terms of their health, in terms of, their well-being in general, mental well-being in particular. How do they manage their finances? Can we give them some classes about how to do some programming and so on in AI? There are some NGOs already doing that today. So that gives them a fulfilling experience beyond just work and rest. And I think that is something that would be useful for migrant workers in the next couple of years. We have some plans. We hope for that plans to provide for a far better living experience that they have. And at the same time, we want them to be healthy and fit. We want them to, not be away from their work as much as they can. They too want to work because they get money by working. So they want to work, and we want to try to encourage that. So we hope not for there to be a similar issue that we saw during the pandemic, where the dorms are all shut and they're all living within their dorms and so forth. And we hope for, and that means that there's a virus that's brewing within the dorms. That's not going to be very helpful. And hence, many of the infrastructural works that we put in place and that we continue to put in place is really to make their dorms more, for the airflow in the dorms to be better, so that, they don't need to incubate viruses, and they are a bit more, they have a lot more access to windows and fans and so forth. That provides for far better living condition for them. So some of these infrastructural changes, I think, will bring them a long way. And I hope that when they come to Singapore and they work in Singapore, that they are happy to be in Singapore, as our surveys have suggested. So not only from a financial perspective, but from a social and mental health perspective too.
Yeah.
Having said that, I hope for them to add value to Singaporeans too. Of course, doing the work that Singaporeans are not doing is one way that they're helping Singaporeans. But we do hear of very heartwarming stories where they do step forward and help Singaporeans. Whenever that Singaporeans are in trouble, maybe a kid who's stuck on a ledge or a traffic accident, you see migrant workers going down instinctively to help them. And I think that is something that needs to be celebrated. It is natural for Singaporeans sometimes to feel that, I don't want migrant workers to be within my estate. And that's an understandable perspective, but we must remember that they are humans too. And of course, if they have their place to be, they should be in their dorms and their recreational centers. But once in a while, if they do come out to the community, either they buy some food in the coffee shops or if they buy some groceries from the markets and so forth, we should encourage that, and we should not try to typecast people as much as we can. And we should show them the heart once in a while because they are helping us too. So that, I think, is a useful message for Singaporeans as well. To be fair, by and large, almost every Singaporean that I speak to absolutely understands this. They know that migrant workers are here to help us, and they are in general appreciative of migrant workers. So it's a two-way street. Both sides will have to compromise, understand one another, get to know one another, and accept each other as part of the community. Migrant workers, when they are in the community, should also behave themselves and not create unnecessary disamenities to the residents of housing estates, for example. So if we can find a good balance of the two, I think we'll be in a far better place in the years to come.
Yeah. Well, so we have spent much of this conversation talking about actually how the government, what it can do for migrant workers. And I was going to get to the point about ordinary Singaporeans and the role that they may be able to play in this conversation as well. And I think you've outlined some of that. What would be the ideal situation for you in terms of bringing Singaporeans into this conversation? Where do you hope to see this go?
Well, to be honest, I truly believe that we are probably already there, where many Singaporeans understand and in general accept and appreciate migrant workers. So we are in a good place. Once in a while, and in certain areas when there are disamenities, it's natural for Singaporeans to feel upset, and therefore we will have to do some education. We'll have to do some degree of somewhat tail end control, right, to make sure that disamenities are not happening in certain areas, especially if there's littering happening in housing board flats, or if they find that there are people around there and so on. They may not quite be very comfortable. So I think we do need it's understandable, and I think Singaporeans have been very accommodative. So I do believe that it's a two-way street, and as much as Singaporeans are accommodative towards migrant workers should also understand the local context and behave as best they can. Of course, understanding that housing areas are meant for Singaporeans, they can always be there, but not to be lying down under the blocks and stuff like that. These are not very helpful actions that sometimes we see certain migrant workers as taking. Doesn't quite happen all the time as well. But as long as that understanding is there and that appreciation is there, we can always find a way to accommodate. And whatever I've highlighted are just very, very fringe and edge cases, really. So I do think that we are in a good place. Migrant workers, by and large, do behave themselves, and Singaporeans are appreciative. Can we do better in both departments? I think we can, but we are starting off on a good footing. So we should just continue what we're doing, allow for that appreciation to take place. I know of schools, even self-help groups are paying a lot of attention of what else can be done to support migrant workers. And I think that's very, very commendable. And on the migrant workers' end, they would have to also, through their own networks, find ways to educate them of what they can and should not do during certain, for example, festivities and so forth. So that's the balance that need to be struck. I know of migrant workers going to religious institutions and supporting the religious institutions as volunteers and doing a lot of the, cutting of vegetables and meat and preparing food, cleaning the place up and so on, all on their own will without any any requirements for salary. And I think that's very, very commendable. But at the same time, Singaporeans would have to see them and appreciate them for what they're doing and not feel as if their religious institutions are overwhelmed or taken over by our migrant worker friends. So it's a constant balance that need to be struck on both sides. And I think I think Singaporeans are very, very reasonable people, to be very honest. And we hope for that to continue. And we hope for community to be formed, particularly for housing estates that are near migrant worker dorms, to understand that they are humans too. They are coming here to make a living, and we try to accommodate as best we can. But if they do things that are against the law or unsavory acts, then they do need to be called out. But otherwise, we should find a way to accommodate one another.
Thank you very much for your time today,
Great. Thank
Minister
you.
of State. Thank
you very much.
That's a wrap for In Your Opinion. I'm Tan Dawn Wei. You can email us your thoughts on this issue. If you'd like to read ST articles or opinion pieces, the links are in our show notes. This episode is produced by Hadi Rahim. Thanks for tuning in.